Hey there, folks. So welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And yes, we got another episode of The Trailing Edge. I know I'm late. I apologize for that. But hey, we got 10 albums on the docket for which I just don't have enough for a full review. Fair warning, while a lot of these albums are pretty good, they are not great. And honestly, a bunch of them are kind of disappointments for which I expected more. But let's not waste any time. Let's get into this. You know, for some of you, I bet this is a surprise that this was not a full-length review. Whereas I think for some others, you might be surprised that I'm talking about this at all, given my, let's say, dicey history with Radiohead and Thom Yorke specifically. Because I know some of you will have gone back to 2014 to see my review of Tomorrow's Modern Boxes, and how I just didn't really care for it, wasn't really my thing. I respected it a lot more than I liked it. And that's saying something because I didn't even really dig into a lot of the content that well, and a lot of the content feels like it was repeating a lot of similar arcs that you would expect from Thom Yorke. Now, I will say that Anima is better than that project. The tones are more expansive. There's a little bit more groove here. I think in terms of propulsive presence and melodic progressions, there's more I like. Shame about a lot of the synth tones that he chooses, though. I don't know what it is. The mix is more expansive and some of the tones work, but he also picks a lot of bleeping, very underweight tones that just don't have the body and support within the mix. They come out in really odd angles, and I'll admit that some of the percussion is not all that impressive to support them either. And along that note, we gotta talk about Thom Yorke himself. I don't know what it is with him on his solo projects, but you would think, given that he's putting his name on this, there'd be a much stronger focus on his vocals. He'd really stretch himself, but no, he sounds very disinterested and faded and muted on this project, and it's not a good sound. I'm not always the most enamored with his voice as it is, and this does not help matters. Now, going into some of the content, I will say that the overarching premise had potential, focusing on dreams and dreamscapes, and it does lead for some evocative imagery, even if some of the more colloquial language kind of pulls you out of the whole experience. But there is a stretch across the middle of the album that had some real atmosphere, and the lyrics factored into that pretty well, until you decode them a little bit and realize, oh wait, this is not really that weird. For one, I will say that in terms of electronic music, and especially both writing and composition and production, it feels like Thom Yorke is kind of lagging behind the experimental guys at the front of the curve. But when you realize that a lot of this is, once again, very technophobic, featuring a lot of bitter alienation, it just gets sour in a way I just do not find all that interesting. Again, I will say this is a slight improvement, and you get in the right mood. I see how this goes down effectively. For the fans, I totally get why they like this. But for me, it's not clicking the way it should. It's okay, but nothing I really experienced that much. I tried to give it multiple chances over the past month or so and didn't really click all the way. Extremely light 6 out of 10, and even then, might not be my thing, but I do think I'm being generous here. Look, folks, I've been trying with this album for some time now. I kept wanting to do a full review of it because I had to think that Banks stepping out with Justin Vernon, trying to get into a slightly more abrasive territory, a little bit more experimental, that would take her pop into slightly more refreshing directions. And yet this album just is not doing it for me. I don't really know where to qualify this. I do think some of it is production elements that I feel, instead of augmenting or enhancing her personality, they only seem to dampen and muffle her. And while it might kind of work with some of the lyrics, I still think the lyricism is thin and not all that appealing overall. And look, I've never been the biggest Banks fan, so when I quote other things that I've had issues with her in the past, as in the album goes on too long, there's a lot of filler, she can't really seem to decide whether or not she wants to be more experimental and abrasive in that indie pop R&B lane, or whether or not she wants to make something that's more conventional to the mainstream, and kind of getting caught in the middle, she kind of winds up being lukewarm. But you know what, it's not terrible. I don't think it's her worst album by any elements. I think that's probably still The Altar, which I thought was just tedious. It's got its moments, it has its audience. I just don't think it's me at this point. Light 6 out of 10. I think there are moments that will redeem this, and I do think she's heading in some intriguing directions, but man, there needs to be a way to make the production to make her sound better. That's all I'm saying. So am I the only one who feels like Devonte Hines is not really playing to his strengths? And I say this with the acknowledgement that while I didn't cover the last Blood Orange album that came out in 2018, I did hear it, and it was okay, it was fine. I'm not really wowed or won over by the very fragmented textural experience that he's putting forward. Yeah, some of the writing and some of the sampling can be really potent in moments, and I really do think that this guy has a command of groove that I find genuinely pretty impressive. The problem is that he rarely focuses on this. In terms of writing more straightforward, cohesive songs, or even songs that punch a little higher, I've just been left cold a number of times at this point. And sadly, that's kind of the case with this project here, which feels more like a series of cast-offs that were kind of thrown together really quickly in terms of a more fragmented textural experience. I'm a little bit reminded of what happened with Solange's last album, except in this case with even less thematic coherence. And again, the best moments come when he dials into some of those 80s R&B grooves that have a little bit more tightness and focuses on a cohesive song structure. Sadly, it doesn't really happen this time around. There's a couple moments I really like, but I'm not going back to this in the same way. I've been giving this a lot of listens the past couple of months, and I'm just not quite wowed, especially when it feels like a lot of the subject matter is starting to repeat itself and the grooves are all the more fragmented, especially when he really should stick with the more organic side. The more he goes towards hip-hop, the stranger and less identifiable it feels. I don't know, solid 6 out of 10. He's got his fan base. I'm not really part of that group as of yet, but if you're curious, check it out. So I have a lot of goth friends who have totally gone crazy over this album. Yeah, they say it's a little bit 80s retro, a little bit more in the dark wave, goth rock, post-punk side of things, but the texture is there. It'll totally sound like a band out of that era. You'll probably have a lot of fun with it. And you know what? I did have some fun with it. But with every Drab Majesty project, I keep looking for that X factor that would be able to effectively differentiate them from the pack, because I hear a lot of Tears for Fears, I hear a lot of Japan, I hear a lot of other acts adjacent to that lane, especially Aha on this project specifically, and yeah, I like those tones, but the knack for hooks doesn't really seem to come through with them. And that's the bizarre thing. The writing doesn't really stand out in the same way either. They've captured the mood so effectively, but they seem not to have realized that cohesive and strong song structures at the core would probably help this stand out a heck of a lot more. Don't get me wrong, it's not bad. I totally get why the retro fetishists love this sort of project, especially if you're in that dark wave post-punk lane, but I don't know, I kind of wish the songs individually popped a little bit more to distinguish them from the avalanche of material that came out in that era and then everyone trying to rip it off these days. So, solid 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious. You probably already heard it if you're into the scene, but if you're not, you can go back to the old stuff. You're not missing a ton here.
You've now tuned into the best station in the world, WBJTC.
I'll be very honest, I'm actually a little bit annoyed that I have not found a BJ the Chicago Kid album I have really loved yet as much as I'd like to. Don't get me wrong, if you're a fan of this guy's crooning and his singing, you'll get on board with this, because this album's got a lot of that. And I'll say this, when he gets into his tighter, more organic groove bag that leans back into some retro soul and funk, sounds really solid. He's got a knack for that sort of brand of R&B that is really compelling, and hell, he's even got a couple guest verses here. I'm a little bit surprised I liked the Rick Ross feature as much as I did on this album. The problem is, and this is a problem I've had with BJ the Chicago Kid for some time, is that as a songwriter, I'm looking for the lyrical elements that'll really jump off the page more in terms of this brand of sexy R&B. A lot of these hookup jams, they can start feeling a little bit interchangeable, especially when he dials into the trap side, and I'll be honest, that's really not his forte and best lane. A lot of the writing almost feels a little stuck in the decade previous. It's stuff we've heard before. It's stuff I could hear from Usher or Neo or hell, even Chris Brown back in that era. And you know what? It's not always bad writing. I think BJ the Chicago Kid tends to do it a cut above most of his peers, but it rarely feels as distinctive as I would like it to, and that's what kind of bugs me. And when the grooves and production can be a little bit inconsistent as well, and I'll be honest, I don't quite love BJ the Chicago Kid on a full album. He's kind of one of those artists that I feel really is on the cusp of making a great album, but tends to pop a lot more on features. As it is, I did like this though, and I actually got a fair amount of replay value, and the best cuts here are truly excellent. So, extremely light 7 out of 10. Worth your time hearing if you get a chance, but again, there's others in this lane of R&B who have done this sound, done a little bit better, but also can push a little bit more boundaries. The further that BJ Chicago Kid starts doing that, then I'll get interested. Okay, this is gonna sound really obnoxious, and I'm entirely aware of it, but I might as well say it. As much as I appreciate King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard writing about environmental themes, I can kind of predict everything they're gonna say in this specific arc, even if they're going into different musical directions. And let me make this clear, this is absolutely a better direction going into vintage old school thrash metal rather than call upon whatever boogie rock thing they tried earlier this year. This is better, but at the same time, it also feels like I don't have a ton to say about it. Yeah, it sounds like old school thrash. A lot of it sounds really good old school thrash, where there's a melodic focus and some pretty killer grooves. But a lot of the writing does not really grab me as much as I really wanted to, especially because I've seen them trace this route before. Apocalypse, environmental catastrophe, primarily man-made. A lot of our efforts to escape it will be ultimately fruitless in the face of the wild world to come. Again, this is stuff that's been well traced before, and while King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard do it well, it's not really jumping off the page in the same way, and that's a bit frustrating. Now that being said, this album is certainly a lot better than Fishing for Fishies. In terms of the pure instrumentation and raw power, especially from their frontman, this is much more agreeable, at least to me. And again, the writing is not bad, it's just that I've seen it before. But again, this is also the sort of review where I probably could have given this a full review, but honestly, I feel this guy would just be repeating myself with a lot of the content. And again, I'm putting this on the trailing edge, not because it's a bad album by any stretch, but because King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard have been in this territory for some time. And while I like this sound, I don't predict them to stay here, and I kind of wish they would change up the themes a little bit. So, solid 7 out of 10, absolutely worth your time, especially if you like vintage old school thrash and this band does it well. But beyond that, it's good. Not quite great, but still worth hearing. Okay, honest question, how many of you knew this came out? Follow-up question, even if you did know, did you really care all that much? Because, look, I am a Common fan. I think he's put out multiple classic albums, and yet this does nothing for me. I really wanted it to as well. I'm into this side of grown man hip-hop. It's a little bit more relaxed for the cookout, and the production mostly gets there. It's nothing all that special, but it's in a good lane, and Common still sounds great behind the microphone. He can command this sort of production, and I'm not even going to complain about him talking about his family. I didn't give Chance that much of a hard time, and apparently it's going to be a thing with Chicago rappers this year. Common does it too, fine. 3 big problems though. Number 1, if we're doing this lane of grown man hip-hop, Little Brother frankly runs circles around this project. Number 2, for as much as Common is very liberal progressive, you'd think in this political climate, and given the sort of political analysis he's put out in the past, he'd get a little bit more transgressive than this. It feels like he's really taking it easy, really painting with a light brush, and I gotta be honest, that's not where I am right now, so it did not resonate. But the third part, man, this album gets corny, and not in the whole extent of even dad jokes, which I can tolerate a good dad joke, but this did not get there. It gets a little cringeworthy at points, and for someone like Common to get into this lane, even though he has been corny in the past, no, this kind of hurt. I'm not gonna say it's bad, but this is not an album I'm gonna revisit. Very light 6 out of 10. Check it out if you're curious, but don't blame me if you don't remember it at all. On the topic of albums that I really want to like, I got a weird feeling going through this new Tarja album, specifically tied back to that project that I reviewed from Within Temptation way early in the beginning of this year, in that, yeah, the vocals are good, a lot of the writing is more colorful, I like that, and I will say this, the symphonic elements are a lot better handled than a lot of the production on the last album, but as charitable as I've been to Tarja in the past, this is not wowing me, and I really wanted it to. Part of this is coming with the expected electronic embellishments, which, let's be real here, they don't fit with anything. They're a very poor fit for her voice. They don't allow a lot of contributions to the melody. Frankly, they just become obtrusive and awkwardly produced whenever they do come in. Sometimes they even interfere with Tarja's vocal pattern, and that's the last thing you want. The other problem, unfortunately, comes with a lot of the arrangements. I wish that the hooks were a lot stronger than they are. Don't get me wrong, they're not bad. There are a couple good moments here, but Tarja has done more with less, and that really gets distracting, especially when you realize that the starting of the album is a little bit more of a breakup themed project, and then it kind of goes off the rails thematically. It goes more into thought experiments that don't really have the same thematic ties. Again, I think that Tarja has done a lot in the past that's really kept her in her good graces. I'll always love her work with Nightwish. But when an album that's called In the Raw is one of your most overproduced projects to date, or even just the production becomes the problem, yeah, that ain't good. It's still not bad. I see it satisfying her target audience, so I'm thinking a 6 out of 10, but again, coming off her last couple projects, which I really loved, this did feel like a step back. Just saying. And on the topic of disappointments, you know what? If you've heard a Lindsey Stirling album before, you've heard this. Frankly, I'm a little bit stunned that after all the promise she had off of her second album, she's doing something that is so rote and routine for her. The electronics really are not switching up, and even when they do, they feel about a year out of date. A lot of the violin work, it's pretty, but I'm longing for some sort of greater orchestral expansion behind her, and the production, I'm sorry, a lot of the blending, especially when it comes to the electronic pieces, they feel either way too thin or way too poorly balanced with a lot of the synth tones that she chooses to use, and frankly, a lot of her violin work. I'm not saying that it sounds terrible, but it feels like something, again, I've heard this before, and Lindsey Stirling singing more, that's not what she needs. Again, the bigger problem here is that it's just kind of forgettable. It's not terrible, it's certainly agreeable, it will please her fan base, but she's not gonna win any new fans with this, and there was a point in her career where she very much was. I don't know, folks. I think I'm being extremely generous with an extremely light 6 out of 10 because, again, it will serve her target audience, but pretty much no one else. So I have to say this has easily been one of my most anticipated projects to come out this year. And yeah, the fact that it's on the trailing edge implies it's a disappointment, but I do want to say it is a good album. A lot of work that Lower Dens has been putting forward in the past couple of while is implying they're going in a lot more politically charged direction. And that's a big step, and that absolutely conveys into some very personal subject matter in a lot of the writing. I do think this album has a lot of punch in that direction, and those best songs like Young Republicans genuinely kick a lot of ass. I'm not gonna say it's incredibly politically cutting in comparison with some of the other work we got this year, but you know what? Coming for this band, going in a little bit sharper direction there, the right steps. I just wish the production and the rest of the synth work was up to par. That's the annoying thing. For as strong as the hooks that came off of Escape from Evil and Nootropics, the fact that the hooks are not stronger on this project is a little bit distracting. And some points you literally have the synth lines that are so busy and overdeveloped that they don't really complement a lot of the overall groove of the project. And we're not getting another To Die in LA on this album, and yes, that is disappointing. I'm not gonna say it's a total loss, but when you consider also that the themes are a little bit more diffuse, going in more of a personal direction does kind of fit with the very politicized nature of this project, but at the same time, it doesn't quite hit as strongly as I really wanted it to, and thus I do see this comeback for Lower Dens as a little underwhelming. So it's getting a 7 out of 10. Definitely recommended if you're into this brand of early 80s, a little overmixed synth pop. You got some stock Akeman and Waterman parts to some of the blending that will definitely be up some people's alley, and you can definitely tell it was intentional, but I want to love this more. Doesn't quite get there. So, but still, you know what, if you're curious, check it out.